Welcome to Agile to Agility podcast with Miljan, Bajic. Major show alert!
The very first value we wrote is individuals and interactions.
Let's take this to another level.
What pisses me off when people say, "Oh, Agile doesn't work," or "It's dead," or you've seen all this stuff, and then you go ask the question, well, "Why isn't it work?" And it's because they're not doing nowhere near anything that Agile says.
Who is John Miller? How would you describe yourself?
How I describe myself? Curious, always willing to try something different to make things better. Get a kick out of seeing people improve in some way. It's always a serotonin kick or dopamine, whatever that is. So yeah. I think curious. Always, I critique everything. So part of the curiosity is I also critique everything, including myself. I'm a Scrum trainer as well, but I critique Scrum all the time. Like, yeah, Scrum great here, but some issues over there. So, but I'll critique everything. So curious, but also I'll look at everything from every angle and find the weakness. But that's also, I think, part of the next step of improving something is finding the areas to improve in. So yeah.
Nice. And that made me think of you've redesigned your CSPO class recently, and I think you said you were happy but not happy with it, and you went through this whole process of kind of taking it apart, and then initial response, as you were kind of iterating through it. Could you maybe discuss that whole process? Why did you decide to redesign your CSPO class? What did you learn from that experience? And because that goes into that kind of not question everything, but always look for ways to improve and look from different perspectives. So could you share that?
I'm laughing because it's just an unexpected question and very funny. But yeah, so I have this certified Scrum product owner class, and it was I did really well with it. People liked it. Always got good feedback, and I just saw some big problems out there, and I thought maybe I'm reinforcing some of those problems that I see in some of my product owner class. And whatever you might want to call it, feature factories, whatever it might be. And I start to think about, well, what's the root cause of those things, or root causes of those things? And it all went back to me of just not understanding real needs of real users and understand the real problem. And a lot of at least mine, and I see other product owner classes, they kind of started the vision and they go from there. But it's too late at that point. You've already solutioned. Once you got a vision, you already have a solution in your mind. So I'm like, that's probably the wrong place to start. It's premature, So I'm just said, I want to redo it and really rethink it and try to fix this issue that I see out there of a lot of waste, solving the wrong problem sometimes, but just getting this kind of velocity focus that we hear about, which is a big problem. I think you need some velocity. I'm not knocking on it, but it's about I'd rather have no velocity if we're solving the wrong problem, right? That's just waste of money and time. So went back, redid it, did a lot of things around jobs to be done. I found that for me, the framework for me from Tony Alwick's job to be done gets kind of right to the heart of, trying to understand the problem and the needs very clearly. So I redesigned it, did it, and my class sucked. We can just tell people are like, I'm teaching some things and stumbling a little bit because I have some of these I haven't done before. But I knew it was the right thing. So I knew this is the right problem to solve. I think this is a good solution. I wouldn't say the solution, but a good solution. So I kept at it. But, I put a lot of my identity and pride into my teaching and my coaching. And when I'm not doing well, I get depressed. So I had this spiral depression of, I'm doing terrible. And it wasn't awful. I'm probably awfulizing a bit. I mean, I got some good feedback, but wasn't nowhere near as my other classes. But I just kept at it. It probably took me, many iterations. And I said, you know what? All I'm going to do is product owner classes. It's painful. What is it? I think Ken Beck said, if it's painful, do it more often. So I said, you know what? I'm going to keep doing them until I figure it out. But now it's actually one of my best classes, better than I think any class I've ever done. But really proud of it. It opens up a lot of eyes. A lot of people do not expect to be going that far into the problem space. And I keep them there pretty much all day one is you need to know your problem. If you don't know that, the rest, you can write the best user stories in the world, but they're just ghost stories. Those are they're fantasy problems that you're trying to solve. But every time I iterate it, try to find something better. Some of it was just the content was good. It was the right content. It was the teaching and how do you make it understandable? So I just went back and kind of went back to basics of, okay, how would it just pure foundational basics of teaching? I said, well, I need to show an example. A good teaching practice I find from education, the education world is I do, you do, we do. And so because some of this stuff was complicated, it was very, not complicated, but they're not used to it. It's not a habit for a lot of people. They're just writing user stories, not really getting to that problem space. So I kind of remodeled it from the I do, like I'm going to show you an example, how I would go through it. Let's do one together, kind of in that way I can give you feedback as we're doing it. And then you go off and do your own thing.
And do it.
Yeah.
That's a couple of things are going through my head. So like when I prep a little bit, I don't spend a lot of time, maybe half an hour or so. I was reading through your tweets, and one of the things that stood out is deliberately get uncomfortable. And this reminds me of that, to deliberately get uncomfortable, because I can relate to like getting comfortable with like, hey, it's great class, nothing needs to change, but to actually redesign a class and then try to deliver that successfully is painful. Like you said, it's ups and downs, but the reward is worth it.
Yeah.
Through that process. And why is it so hard for a lot of people to get uncomfortable? And is it just the human nature? What are your thoughts on that?
Because
I think we all
I don't know, it's uncomfortable and we don't like it. I don't know. I don't know the answer to it. I just know growth comes from it. And every time, I remember sitting there one time thinking, how do I grow? How do I get better? And I kept thinking, anytime I had adversity, I grew. Like anytime I went this, I didn't like it. I wish I wasn't in it. But at the end of it, I look back, I'm like, wow, I'm stronger and better and whatever it might be. I worked through my insecurities, whatever that was. And I just remember one day I was like, why don't I just create my own adversities? We're kind of lucky in modern age for many of us. I don't say everyone. I don't want to mean that. Maybe from a place of privilege, but a lot of us have a lot of our basic needs taken care of. So the idea of this big adversity, sometimes you have to manufacture it, right, to get it. And so I kind of had this thought, like if I really want to grow, I kind of have to create my own my own adversities. But why is it? I don't know. I don't know why it's so hard, but it's just painful.
But I think a lot of it is painful, but I know personally, like it's painful, but I know it's a good process. I used to, build websites and design websites, and back in the day, in late 1990s, early 2000s, computers would crash and you would lose, all of the work. But I always knew, even though it was painful, to redo everything from scratch, it was always better than where I had it. So even though. So I was just, interested to hear your thought on that.
Yeah. I mean, just even this morning, we were talking about fitness before the podcast but, even I wake up, like I'm achy, I'm older, I'm 46 and I just started judo last week and that's really making me sore. I'm not good at it. I'm getting thrown around all the time. But I'm really sore and achy. I'm like, God, like I'm like, if I was in my 25s, I wouldn't feel it like that. But I woke up this morning, I was like, I'm going to go lift weights. Like it's painful, but I'll feel better when I'm done. And then I have a pool and it's like 60 degrees Fahrenheit right now in the pool. And I'm going to jump in the pool. And that's cold for me anyway. It's cold. So I'm like, breathe. I'm going to jump in and just knowing by jumping in, like just the mental act of doing something uncomfortable. I know like what's the worst that's going to happen today? If you face kind of the painful things in the morning. So yeah, I think you need to face those things head on.
Yeah, that is, I don't know, like you said, it's tough. We all know probably what's a good thing, but it's tough. To come back to jobs to be done, and you talked about understanding customer and problems that people face rather than just focusing on features. What stood out? How did you get introduced to jobs to be done? Because You and I have talked about it, and you've kind of shown me a couple of things that I didn't know, but I'm curious to know. And the framework itself and the idea has been around, but I'm interested. Like, how did you get introduced to it? What do you see as
Yeah.
as key kind of
Yeah,
parts
I'm
of
not quite
that
sure how
framework?
I got introduced to it. It's just one of those things that kept showing up, and then one day I just get really curious more about it. I kept actually, I know I heard a lot about it in the Strategizer. You know, they talked about what's the job. They have their value proposition canvas, and they talk about customer jobs. So I probably maybe started there, but then I started to get really curious. Like, it's still wasn't concrete enough for me. Like that value proposition canvas, I think it's useful, but it didn't go deep enough for me about understanding it. And even after reading the books, so and I just started researching different. And there's different. It's like Agile in some ways. Is that there's different flavors of it. Like you have different camps. Just like someone will say Kanban is this and Scrum's that. You actually have this kind of divide in jobs to be done as well. Like these different authors, and they have their own viewpoints on it. But I gravitated a lot to Clayton Christensen's book. He talked a lot about jobs done. I think can't remember the book name, but the book that really helped me, or the resource that really helped me the most, and what I find more useful for my style, was Anthony Alwick's Jobs to Be Done, which he originally called outcome-driven innovation, and he gets very practical about it. Where I see a lot of these others are very aspirational. Which just isn't my thing in some ways. It's like, hey, like say you get a saw, like your product's a saw. Well, what's the job? Well, I want to cut wood, right? Just that simple. It's like the simplicity. I want to be able to cut wood, and then he breaks things. It's a very complicated. He's got lots of stuff, but simplifying it, he breaks down jobs into, what's the basic situation they're in when they're trying to cut wood, or a constraint. So, for example, say you're a diabetic. And the constraint might be, well, I want to give myself an insulin injection, but my hand's shaking, right? So the constraint there, the situation would be my hand shaking. So how do I get that job done of insulin shot? And then he just chops it up into 3 areas, which I find really useful, which is the functional job, which is cut the wood, get my insulin shot. And then he has emotional jobs. How do I want to feel? How do I want to... what's the experience for me that I like to have personally, and a social job. He describes it as how do you want others to perceive you? I add on to that a little bit because I feel it's a little, I don't know, a little too shallow maybe. I like to add, how do others perceive, how do you want to be perceived? And also, how do you want to relate to others? And it sounds silly. There's some things like tools. I think, is there a social job for everything? I'm not sure, but and someone even had this in my class. I said, I'm not sure about if you had a tool set, if there was a social job. And someone said, well, actually, yeah, there is. Like if you're really into tools, you want to show off your tool, you might have say, hey, this brand, and kind of show like, yeah. So, there's always this opportunity to at least ask if there's a social job.
Exactly.
So
it's almost like a lens or perspective that you can take, that you don't necessarily have to, but when you talk to students about the problem space and the solution space, and you said earlier, a lot of times, and I used to, and I've been, since I spoke with you, kind of like you said, switch to let's look at the problem space first before we look at the solution space. What are the things that you're learning as you're teaching around people's responses to the idea of that there's that problem space and then there's solution space, and not jumping too soon into the solution space?
Yeah, that premature convergence to that solution space is, so what are they learning? Like as I'm teaching, what I notice they're learning, their insights. I think it's just a whole new world for a lot of people. I don't say everyone, some people know that, but a lot of people, especially in the Agile Scrum space, they're just used to being, hey, here's a solution someone told us to build. And even sometimes here are the features that stakeholders want. And I find getting them that, stakeholders input's important. And usually when I say stakeholders, I'm talking about internal stakeholders, different executives or other people in the company. And I said, well, their job isn't to be the expert, the customer, yours is. And I think that's a big shift for a lot of people, to a very simple, obvious thing for many people, I think, for some people. but to shift that, you know what? No, I'm as a product owner, I'm supposed to figure out the customer, and I lead the organization to let them know what are their needs, and also get some stakeholder input. I'm not saying they don't have input or information that's valuable, but the product owner is going to triangulate those things and figure out what is the real problem to solve. So I find that's a big eye opener for a lot of people, just that, oh, you don't have to just take orders from stakeholders. Like, they're not the boss, of the product. And often they don't really know what the customer needs in many cases.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something else that you've talked about, and I see, which is like in a lot of companies, we still have like product managers and product owners. Product manager focus more on strategy, product owners and tactics. So like when you teach and when you talk about the problem space, a lot of times people that are put in these product owner roles don't really have the authority, or they don't really, the problem space is not part of their job.
Right.
What is your thought on relating it back to the jobs to be done and what we've been talking about, and this idea of having product managers and product owners, and that divide or misunderstanding in organizations when it comes to those roles?
Yeah, that's where, I pull up my unicorn in my class and say, well, I might be talking about unicorn ideal land. And I get that, right? I mean, this is what I find the best teams are able to pull off, when you're empowered fully. What I call the full range of product ownership is that double diamond of the problem space and the solution space. And you should be able to occupy that whole thing. And I do think a lot of the forms of waste, of building the wrong thing, is upstream. It's not downstream. So I think they get the whys, but you're right. A lot of them are like, yeah, but my boss still tells me exactly what to do, and I have to do it. And I always acknowledge that. Like, yeah, I get that, right? You shouldn't get fired from doing this class, but can you start having those conversations though? Can you start working your way upstream a little bit more? Can you start bringing some of these models and ways of thinking? So if they say, hey, the customer needs XYZ, this feature, and I might say, oh, great, we can write that one down. Put that whatever user story, whatever you want to use. But simply then ask the question, what outcome is that going to provide for the customer? So you start changing the conversation, and maybe they don't know, maybe then, okay, great, and let's figure that out together. So now you start to work, even though you might not be empowered to have the authority, you can start having those conversations, right? To help other people to see that maybe they need to figure that out, or maybe you can help guide them in helping to figure that out.
I mean, like the issue that I see a lot of people, it's all great, John, but I still have to do my job. So me understanding that is great. And I see that in a lot of organizations and through coaching too. And it's tough because now you get more people to see what it takes. And even, the idea of product manager is kind of still sticking with the old structures. And that's why we have, and like product owners are just proxies. Maybe to tie to this, and I don't, in a sense, I see the product manager, product owner, just a leftover of waterfall that, trying to do agile and just people confused. But something that's related to this that caught my attention, I thought maybe something that in a sense I've done too. You said I use agile as a Trojan horse to make organization more sane. And could you maybe elaborate on that? And
wow,
what did you mean by that?
Yeah, I was actually, so my aha here was many years ago, and I was coaching at an organization that many people know. One of my first big coaching gigs, and we were making headway, which we, tend to get in the beginning. As William Bridges once said, uninformed optimism always gives way to informed pessimism. And we were getting through there. People were, getting teams going, and great. And then, things start to, whatever, the stress happens, and then the management goes back to the old way. So I'm bummed out, as I tend to get depressed if I feel like I'm failing and beat myself up. And Michelle Sliger, she's a CST and someone who I really looked up to a lot. She was there with me, and she just pulled me aside, this young little, coach aside, and said, hey, John, just realize, hopefully it's okay for me to quote Michelle here, but she was something like, hey, John, just realize only about 10% of these companies will actually do it. It's just the way it is, right? It's one, being uncomfortable is hard, as you said earlier. Change is hard, all those things. So just realize it's just the way it's going to be. And I said, okay, got it. Made me feel a little bit better. But then I was like, well, there's still something I can do. And it kind of always stayed in my head, but I can't just give up. And she's not saying to give up, but there's still something I can do for the other 90%. And it dawned on me as I helped other organizations, and it helps. And sometimes not be agile. If someone was an agile purist and they came in and said, well, yeah, like, no, they're not. But then I help somehow make it better or enrich usually I do in some way, influence it. And I realized, oh, I can help organizations become more sane. So I have this basic mental model of sanity before agility. Is one, sanity is a prerequisite to agility anyway. And first, you got to get sanity in place, number one. And if you just get that, that's a huge benefit. Even if they don't get the agile part of it, which is the adaptiveness, be able to flow with the environment, but can we just make work more sane for people? So I'd make that my core focus first, maybe using some of that agile language to get in. But again, you got to get to the foundations. And I have, right or wrong, but I have 4 attributes, I think, of sanity if I focus. And I find if you have those 4, it makes Scrum possible. Agile possible, whatever that you're doing. And sometimes you don't even need those other things. One is just focus. And we all know multitasking and doing too many projects. So I would say, one, can we just focus? And that's usually a personal thing that people have influence over. So, even if you have to, like, I have 10 projects and I can't control it. Well, say you're doing Scrum, could you do 2 sprints just on that one project and avoid the multitasking at least? So there's something you can do to minimize the amount of distractions and multitasking, and within almost everyone's power to some degree. The other one would be the ability to break things into small increments, small pieces, right? So you get things done faster, quality, and if you have to multitask, switch to another project, you're done, right? You don't have to do the back and forth. And those 2 things are both, I think, within everyone's influence to some degree. But then there's the other 2. And I think some people will disagree with me out there, and that's fine, is if I can get all the skills needed on a team to eliminate the dependencies and the waiting time and the drama, every time something changes, you have to go back to the other person now, but they're working on something else. So I kind of get all the skills I need in order to get whatever it is done, cross-functional team, as we say in Scrum. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear it, but apparently landscapers have come.
No, it's, it's not picking, maybe a little bit, but no, it's
great. And then obviously I'm a big believer, at least with organizations that don't have this competency yet, of having them as dedicated and stable as possible. So I find if you have those 4 things, those bottom 2, though, those last 2 are more organizational things. Like a person can't directly influence that usually. That will take some leadership or management buy-in. But I find if you start with the 2, then add those other 2, you get like 80% of the benefits, I think, in any agile framework from those 4 things.
No, and the reason that I asked him to tie it back to kind of this discussion that we've had is like a lot of times when I'm teaching, like you said, you see what's going on in organizations. You've in many instances been there. Kind of what needs to happen generally. So some of the things, and it's easy to get demotivated as a trainer. It's easy to get depressed sometimes as a trainer because you see how much people struggle, and a lot of times they just don't. There's lack of that sanity or awareness or whatever you want to call it. And I think it's a good reminder. And what I liked about the Trojan horse is that baby steps, or in some ways people need to get to that sanity, and sometimes it's easier to say you have to get here from there, but it takes time. And going back to Michelle, in a sense, like if such a small percent of organizations truly, make that shift or understand it, it takes time. I don't know who said it, but it's I was interviewing, and it's like a lot of these organizations' survival, is not guaranteed. So the more competition, the more. So to switch gears a little bit, I did want to, and I was going to ask you first about it, but I'm sure you get a lot of questions around Agile education. But I want to ask you, like, what is the current state? You spent a lot of years and you still involved Agile education. How would you describe kind of the progression in agility in or Agile education?
Yeah, it has progressed quite a. I was just talking to someone today, Jennifer Manley, who's does a lot of training and coaching Agile education, and I was like, interesting. When I started, like, there's nothing. The reader's like, hey, this might be interesting to try, and let's see if we can apply and what would happen. But now it's becoming a thing. Like, it has a name. People know what Agile education, and there's people over the world that are trying this thing. They'll contact me and say, hey, we're doing this. And so one is that it's, I wouldn't say it's widespread or any kind of mass, it is nowhere near any kind of like getting to mass adoption, but it is spreading, and people recognize it and they see it as an answer to some problems in education. So, but I started in maybe 2010, 2011, as when we tried it with a classroom, a fourth grade classroom, and we had no clue what we were doing. So and now people I think have a clue, which is pretty cool.
Why do you think the adoption is, as much as it has, like, it makes sense the way that, and what I also like you recently talked about, at least I was aware of it, like how you design the class, or you give level of authority, or what I'm talking about, based on the maturity. And I thought that was great too, because it's kind of what we have in organizations too. Given the amount of maturity, or whatever you want to call it, you kind of have more autonomy as a. Could you maybe talk about that first, and then maybe just elaborate on, like, what would it take for, or maybe what are the impediments to more organization schools adopting some of these Agile values and principles?
Sure. I'll start with the spectrum, what we call the spectrum of collaboration and the spectrum of choice. So unlike, and maybe it's like a little bit like work companies, but if you're doing Scrum or some other Agile thing with a team, they're adults, they're they're professionals, at least most of them are. And you go in and you say, be self-organizing. And, many of them can pull that off. Not always, but many of them can pull that off because they're adults, they have executive functioning, they know how to drive a car and act responsibly and all those things. But if you do this with a kid, self-organize, it might work. I'm not saying it has. I've seen it work kind of instantly with some teams, but some others, these kids are not ready for it. The teacher isn't ready for it, and just goes into chaos, right? And it's not a very good selling point for teachers to try this out. Like, hey, let's try a little chaos in your classroom. And again, it's just because they're not quite ready for it. Their brains are still developing in many ways. Their executive functioning. Same with the teachers. They're not used to learning how to have an environment to allow that to happen. And sometimes they're under some very tight constraints around curriculum and at least in the United States, state standards and state testing that they have to comply to. And so working with teachers, where we first tried it, and we just brought a little bit of Scrum, a little bit of Kanban, and we realized, okay, some of that worked, but some of it wasn't right fit. So we started to play around. And as it started to spread in the classrooms I was working with, after one classroom did it, others started to pick it up. I just would go in, they would ask me to help out or coach. And I would pair it with a teacher who really knew education. And I just wrote down patterns that I noticed. I was like, oh, this one class, I actually caught myself saying it, you're doing it wrong. I didn't say it out loud, but like, you're not doing it the way I taught it. And I was like, no, wait a minute, maybe there's something for me to learn. And I just noticed, they're doing the structures and the visibility, but they didn't bring in the empowerment part of it. But that's what they needed at that time. So I just made a really quick mental model of what I was noticing. And I noticed there was these 4 categories I kind of categorized classrooms in. And it was based off these 2 things, which was collaboration and choice. And it's just like we do in management, we make a 2x2 matrix and voila, you have a framework. And that's my Agile Classrooms framework is 2x2 of choice going up and collaboration. And I realized, oh, traditional classroom, low choice, low collaboration. What you think of as, sitting in rows, listening to the teacher. Some classes were doing individual Agile. They would do passion projects or just work in their own capstone project. I was like, oh, no self-organizing team there, no teams, but they're doing the structure, the planning, the review, the retros, all that, but it's more of a personal level. So personal agility, you might say. So it'll be low collaboration, high choice. Bottom of that would be high collaboration, low choice, which is a cooperative learning environment where kids are in groups, the students are in groups, but they're still doing what the teacher kind of tells them to do. Here's the assignment, here's what you need to work on, but you support each other in doing it. And then the upper right-hand corner is what you think of as Scrum or an Agile team, which is high collaboration, high choice, self-organizing, self-directing teams, self-managing teams. And so it kind of popped it up there. Then I got more granular. So what does it mean to be along the spectrum? So I created, and I had some others help me refine this, part of the Agile education group I've been working with, but these basic 5 steps under each one. And so the cool thing with it is you can start wherever you are. Just like you said, you take these steps. You don't just go all in. It may take years. So the great thing with this is a little bit like, hey, teacher, you want to try this out in a safe way? Well, first get the sanity part, I guess, in some ways. It's like, here's the structure, here's a rhythm, and it's inspired by, it's not quite Scrum because it's not by the Scrum guide, but you'll see a lot of Scrum in there of kind of the basic sprints kind of framework. So try that, give it a rhythm, start modeling that and say, hey, here's what we're doing. We're going to plan today. And this is what I'm thinking about doing. So you start modeling that first, getting students to understand it. And then you put some structures, some visible, I call it visible learning artifacts, like the boards or the big team agreements, whatever it might be. You start with that, and then you start inching up. They start to learn the process. And you're like, okay, now this time, how about you figure out the how? I'll tell you what we're going to do. But maybe for this part, you can come up with some ideas of how. And then once they got that, you can kind of work their way up. And what we call scaffolding in education. And same thing for collaboration. Maybe do it by yourself. Let's try it now with the team, with a small group. And then let's really see what it means to have shared ownership, where you're not dividing and conquering the work, where Miljan does this and John does that, which is like a level 3 in the collaboration spectrum, cooperative learning. What does it really look like to be a real collaborative, self-organizing team, which is, it doesn't really matter. As long as we get that work done, we'll all swarm on that together.
It's interesting because I did maybe 3-4 years ago, CSM type of class for undergraduate university. And I ran it it was really fun, like from an engagement standpoint, and the feedback and some of the things that I got, which remind me of, me being in school, which is like, even coming from Europe, where education is different, the way that you learn, the way that you collaborate, but even in the United States, it's not necessarily very collaborative. I hated college. In a sense, like I don't think I retained I paid mostly for the social experience of going and for but when I saw like how they interacted there in the class, where like in a sense these are like maybe 17, 18-year-olds, how they self-organize and the responsibility. Like I told them, you have to, if you want to show up. If you're not, like, you're part of a team, you guys have to figure things out. And it was interesting how those 17, 18-year-olds kids embrace this idea of ownership, of collaboration, how engaged they were. And I'm like, this is such a foreign thing to most universities. Yet if I asked all of these people, if they remember, concept from this class, if they remember their experiences, if they remember and develop better relationships with people in the class, rather where you're sitting, they would have all said yes. And I was like, I wish I had classes like this in college. Like maybe I could have justified so coming back to the question of why do you think there is not an explosion of using these methods and these ways to, essentially collaborate, learn in all levels.
Yeah, I think it's a bit, schools I find are a fractal of what we do in corporations. I mean, it's very similar. If you think we have a bigger societal thing that we all share. So one, it's just very similar things of the idea of what if I let go of control. It's very scary, right? Especially with, and this is one reason, it's not the reason. I think many educators would like to, but there's a lot of fear there. There's a lot of eyes on an educator, a teacher, especially in public schools for sure. I'm sure other privates as well, but definitely public schools where not only do you have a bunch of kids you don't want to fail, because their lives are in your hand, their futures are in your hands. That's big risk. Two, you have parents also that might even say some will support it, but some might be like, aren't you supposed to be teaching my kid how I learned, right, when I was in school? So you get parents now that are, that I find a lot of parents actually love it. What I've seen, they love it because the kids go home and share it with their parents. But there's that fear. And then you have administrators, principals, and all that, who do classroom observations, who might not get it. And like, hey, this isn't quite what we're expecting, maybe out of the classroom. So I think there's a lot of fear, a lot of eyeballs on them that makes any kind of risk, trying to do something innovative or different, makes it really risky.
So this made me think of, jobs to be done and feature factories versus jobs to be done, and looking at the problem, right? The problem is to get students, at least in university, to be ready for work, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about it, it's just, bunch of let's give them a bunch of classes, create this program and have a diploma at the end.
Yeah.
But when you look at it, the job to be done is really for students to be ready to work and
ready for life and work. Yeah,
life and work.
Yeah.
And I don't know. Do you think maybe from that perspective?
Yeah, actually, I have a jobs to be done for Agile Classrooms work that I do, and it's pretty much something like that. It's really to get you future ready, right, for 21st century ready for life and work. And I like the life part because there's these real skills. How do I communicate with people? How do I, how do I connect? How do I set my own goals, right? My own personal and see it through. And I find that the students who do this will actually apply it in their real life. That they get a sense of. Actually, I remember, I'm going to go deviate a bit, but I remember working in one school. And it was an underprivileged school, and a lot of these kids have a hard time, economically and other things that are against them. But I just remember showing them a basic kind of Kanban board, Scrum board, and saying, here, think about what you want to do that day, for your life. And you can see them all lean forward. And I was like, wow. And what I realized just intuitively is like, wow, they're seeing there's a tool here that they can control their life. And that's really useful to them. Like, wow, I can use this to have agency in my own life. So yeah, I do think that is a big job to be done, is that sense of agency in your own life, and knowing what you're, be able to make better choices and learn from those choices and the consequences. So yeah, I think that is the big job, and I think the great thing with Agile in education, at least Agile classrooms, is as you're going through the content, and which again, teachers don't have control over for many of them. Like, it is state standard curriculum, some good, some maybe not useful. But some of those might be realistic in real life, like really useful. Some of them might not be, but the skills of applying, like you did in your undergrad classroom, those skills are always useful. So the cool thing with this, and you kind of get two birds with one stone, is that you still can use your basic learning content, go through your curriculum, right? You still can do that. That'll be your backlog in some ways. But by applying this, you don't have to teach 21st century skills, which a lot of teachers, like education approaches will teach collaboration, will teach critical thinking. And I don't think that's the way to do it. I think what you have to do is use it all the time. And by doing this, they're constantly wrapping the 21st century skills around any of the content they're using today.
Everything that they do,
everything. And the exact same thing, the impact that I saw from 3rd grade to 4th grade all the way up, is those deepening relationships. I say it deepens learning and it deepens relationships, and the connection they have, and the idea of like them supporting each other instead of teasing each other in the classroom. It showed up even like on the playground where if they saw someone bullied, like they would be like, hey, we hold a kind of like they hold accountability to each other. Like they will learn to speak up if somebody wasn't honoring, the right thing to do.
Yeah. Another interesting thing that just reminded me, and we're kind of going a little bit off, but like, how in college when we went, like you would take your individual notes, and a lot of times I joke around, I did pay people to take notes for me, because for whatever reason. And I was in a class, and like recently, and this was like class for like mostly students, not the class that was, and like everybody's taking notes in Euro, like on my mural, and I'm like, what's going on here? Like, people are making notes as I'm sharing ideas and talking, and like I'm like, what's going on? They're like, we do this, like, we share notes, we have one document where like people add things to it. And that was interesting from that relationship standpoint too, and collaboration, because now you had people collaborating and exchanging thoughts, and adding to the conversation while I was talking, and as we were all kind of collaborating through this, because it triggered like their comments or what they were doing. Have you experienced anything like that like points to like maybe a generational shift of how we learn and collaborate? What are some of the other things that you've seen that maybe people would not expect to see?
Yeah, it's interesting actually just hearing what you said about Miro, and just the shared just got me thinking like, oh, how can I maybe apply some of that? That's interesting. So the generation, I'm not sure about the generational thing. I don't know. It's hard for me to say like this generation's like this and that generation's like that. I can stereotype people, but what I find, at least with younger people, in school, is they haven't been conditioned yet like we have. And it's actually easier. I actually find if I get a fourth grade, like I find actually elementary school is the easiest, to some point, like maybe third grade, fourth grade, they're the easiest ones to start this with, because they just pop there and like, yeah, this just makes sense. That's the way they play on the playground. If you watch kids on the playground, they don't wait for someone to tell them the rules. They'll make up the rules as they go, and they'll agree to it. There's this natural social interaction that happens. They naturally create these self-organize their own rules, and they hold accountability to it. So I find it's natural, especially if you see that state of play. And of course, there's accidents and fights, but they're human, just like anyone. But what I find is they're not conditioned yet that we have to do it this way. And I find doing Agile for a fourth grade team is a lot easier than doing it in an adult team in many ways. They just go at it. They're open. They're vulnerable. The vulnerability is actually what astounds me, is where there's one activity called the My World Map, and they'll interview each other. So I'm like, my daughter in her school, they'll do like, tell me everything about you. And they do, they'll do a little thing and they bring it in. And I always say, well, why not just talk to another kid and figure out everything about them? You do a project, and then you're learning empathy, you're learning listening. So I have this one activity called the My World Map, where we just sit down. It's like a little mind map, and a little visual mind map, some pictures. And I'll say, hey, what are your strengths? What are you proud of? And I write that down. But I'm asking you questions, I'm learning, and we bring it out, and I'll share it out. Hey, here's what I learned about Miljan. And but the cool thing is when you get into, I don't say weaknesses, what I say is, where do I need support? Where might I need support in my work or whatever? And I find it amazing in high school kids, or just how vulnerable they are. Like one kid said, I get really angry and I don't like it. I don't like that I get angry. I try to control it. And when they did that, like the team just was really amazing. They went around him, just started hugging him. Like, wow, like it's crazy. So I think it's, in some ways, they're just more open to these things. And when you give them the opportunity to do it and treat them like true humans that are really capable of these things, it's quite amazing how they rise really high up.
Yeah, it is. And like, we talk about in professional setting how important it is to do those things, because that's what builds trust, that's what builds great teams. Yet it's either that conditioning or whatever it is that it makes it a lot more difficult in a professional, I guess, setting to do it. We don't have a lot of time, and I'm thinking about questions that I still haven't asked you, but I do want to get your thought on one question that's also a little bit off or in a different direction, about Mike Beadle. Recently, somebody told me that you've been part of that initial group, and I've been doing these series, so like I haven't had a chance to ask you, but what is your memory of Mike Beadle, and how has he impacted, your thinking and
Yeah.
perspective on Agile and Scrum?
Yeah, well, I think Mike Beadle's made an impact on a lot of people. For me as well. He's the one who helped me become a Scrum trainer. I think he helped do some co-trainings with them, and he really helped guide me along with some things, a lot of things. I think what I remember about Mike is there's a lot of egos out there. If you haven't noticed, there's a lot of people with egos. Maybe in some in the Agile space, perhaps in the Scrum community, maybe a few. And with Mike, even though he was, he had this pedigree and so, or this, I don't know what you call it, but it was the Agile Manifesto co-author and helped write, the first book on Scrum. I mean, he's been around, he's got a name. He just never used it. Like it was never a thing. And he'd always champion you. Like at least with me and the others I saw, he was always saw like what you're great at. He tried to champion you and cheerlead you. I never seen him put anyone down. He was always optimistic about what you could do. And he would even throw it out. Like I'm a nobody, right? But he would just throw it. And John, he said this, and he just talked to others and he'd some way bring you into it to make it feel like you were, I don't want to say special, but he acknowledged you, and I never saw him put anyone down. So that's the thing I think I remember most about Mike was just his optimism, I think really belief in people, that they can do some really great things.
Yeah. What about Enterprise Scrum? Like, I was involved a little bit when he started, involved in a sense, aware. I wouldn't say involved, but more aware. But some of the stuff that he was thinking was, and others have said this too, was ahead of its time. What are your thoughts as far as like Enterprise Scrum and how that kind of still is sprinkled all over kind of what we do, what's being talked about today?
Yeah, I think what I liked about what he's doing in Enterprise Scrum was very much mirrored what I was doing in Agile Classrooms, is that you need to help people configure it for them, and that you need to adapt it to different environments. And so that's one thing I really liked about it. It wasn't like you must do the Scrum guide by, verbatim exactly how it says. And it was really about, context driven. Like, what's your context? What's going to work for you? And to get people to think, through that, not one framework is going to, one prescriptive framework is going to fix your problems, that you need to design your solution. But he gave you some tools to help you through that. So I do think, though, that it was still early on and it had to be, polished or expressed a little bit more for people to really kind of get it, so where it could maybe be spread a little bit further. But I think it was just very in the early phases of it. But I really loved his just approach to it, of that here's some ways of thinking that you can configure this and make it work for you.
Yeah, and the reason that I asked is like we live currently and probably for the foreseeable future, meaning next 5 or so years, in a land where these prescriptive frameworks are popular. Companies are buying into this stuff. Yet, for a lot of us, going back to what Mike was saying, and what you're saying, it's about contextualizing. It's not about taking these recipes and trying to apply them, but actually contextualizing. So when I look at future, the future is the ideas in a sense of Enterprise Scrum and some of these ideas that you have to contextualize. You have to look at the context and what to apply in that context, what work, try to. What is your perspective on the current state of Agile, kind of where we're going, where it is, maybe as a last question?
I don't know. I guess the only thing I can think of is there's many states of Agile. That's all I can say. There's many states of Agile.
Maybe let me ask you this way: like, what pisses you off about the current state of Agile, and what makes you excited or maybe optimistic about what
Well, I guess
might be in the
what
future?
pisses me off is when, and I don't think it's right for everyone. So I don't, I think, hey, you got to find what's right for you. Agile may be, Agile might not be. So I don't push. I'm not like a pusher of Agile. But what pisses me off when people say, "Oh, Agile doesn't work," or "It's dead," or you've seen all this stuff, and then you go ask the question, well, "Why isn't it work?" And it's because they're not doing nowhere near anything that Agile says. And then you hear the other rebuttal, which I get where they're coming from. That, well, it sounds like if if everyone's using it wrong, it's designed wrong. I'm like, no, I see people doing the wrong thing in the gym all the time, lifting weights, bad form. Doesn't mean a squat is designed wrong. Like, they're just doing it wrong and they're going to damage themselves and they're going to say squats suck. Working out's not good. Like, no, you just need to learn how to do some of it with some integrity, with some discipline. So I think that makes me, irritates me a bit, seeing those comments, and when they say it with such confidence as well. So yeah, that bothers me a lot. I mean, at the same time, you need to be able to adapt things to your environment too. But it doesn't mean you do it, you bastardize it. And I think just the way it is, things get more popular. People start, it becomes a buzzword as it is. People will start using it, the name of it, and you know how it is. Same complaints I have, you probably have. And it's just not at all with, I call it, Ron Jeffries calls it dark Scrum or dark Agile. And Darth Vader, gets a hold of the sprint planning meeting, and well, doesn't matter. If you have the Agile manifesto hanging up, it's not going to be a good sprint planning meeting. It's going to suck. So that's I think with the popularity though, that's kind of just a natural state of things. I personally think what will happen is it will at some point arc out, die out, something else will come up, but it'll be the same thing, just with a different name. I think it's always happened in some ways. It gets reincarnated. And because it's the old words, the old tools have bad baggage, and they recreate the new thing, and it's really the same thing in a new wine bottle kind of thing.
Yeah. So not a true paradigm shift, just maybe a shift. What about the positive stuff? What is motivating you, or maybe?
Yeah, I do think there's innovation happening in the Agile space for the people that really get it, and the idea that you don't need to be shackled to following every prescriptive rule, and that people really do get the bigger principles or the paradigm that's behind it, and that they will take it and try some things and do some new things. And so I do think that is happening out there too. You don't hear a lot of those stories out there, but there's people who are like, does it work? And did it make people happier, more productive, or more engaged? Like, yeah, great. And even though it's not in a book somewhere, it's not in a class. So I think a lot of those things are happening. And actually, I wish we, organizations that are out there that have money and resources like Scrum Alliance or whoever else that are out there, scrum.org, I'm sure they're doing some things, but I wish they would further the Agile movement versus just say, here's what it is, and let's just keep it going. I'd rather say, what is the new thing that's out there? Go learn, like, what are the great things that are happening out there? Bring it back and share it so we can evolve Agile versus trying to institutionalize Agile and keep it still.
Exactly. Yeah, that is, and that could be a separate topic. What would you like to leave the listeners with, like a tip, a message? What is one thing maybe that for the end that you want to share? Maybe what you do in class, I don't know. Just a tip, maybe final thought.
I'll use the basic Frozen 2. I'll use the Frozen 2 mantra, which is just do the next smallest right thing. That's it. I just add the smallest part of it there. So that's it. It's like what you talked about. How do you get to an ideal version? Well, it's based on where you are. What's the next right thing? And what's the smallest thing I can do to move forward and learn if it's the right thing? And that's it. I think it's all you can do in life and work.